Welcome to today's Religion Media Center briefing on Holocaust Memorial Day. We meet on a particularly news-packed day as the ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza and Israel is underway, TikTok comes back online in the United States, and we await the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term. In light of all that, thank you very much for choosing to be with us for what promises to be a fascinating discussion. We have with us today a child survivor of the Holocaust, a composer and conductor who has not only researched, but actually recreated music composed in Auschwitz, and the chair of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. I'm sure you'll have questions to ask them. As Ruth said, please put your questions in the chat, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. Joan Salter is a child survivor of the Holocaust, one of a tiny number of unaccompanied Jewish children who managed to reach the United States during the war. We're all familiar with the story of the Kindertransport, where Britain accepted nearly 10,000 Jewish children into the country before World War II. The United States, on the other hand, took in far fewer children, extremely few, as young as Joan. Joan now lectures about her experience and has regularly visited Poland, where her parents came from, for ceremonies marking the anniversary of the deportation of Jews from the town her father came from. Joan Salter, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Joan, your parents left Poland in search of a better life well before the Nazis invaded it in September 1939. They were in France at the time and fled to Belgium, thinking they would be safe from Hitler there. But things did not work out as they expected. What happened to you and your family?
Yes, so my parents remained technically Polish Jews, although they had lived in Paris for most of their adult life. My mother was from Warsaw, and my father from Tarnów, which is a big town near Krakow. And my mother was actually a widow with a young child when she met my father in the mid-1930s. And they were married in 1938. And barely 6 months later, the Nazis invaded Poland. And the news was coming out. You know, there's a lot of people said, oh, the world didn't know anything. Well, yeah, they did know. And my father knew that Germany would invade westward. And he, my mother, and my half-sister moved into Brussels, where he had distant cousins. And I was born February 1940. And I was 6 months old when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands and Belgium, and then went on to France until the armistice there in mid-June. So initially, in France and countries like Belgium, there was a large number of foreign Jews, mainly Polish Jews. And initially, they were being targeted, but it was only the men of working age that were being targeted. And part of that was to cause a delusion of that they were only sending men away for labor and all that. Anyway, my father was amongst the first taken, and eventually he was taken down and put in prison inside France. And my mother remained in Belgium with my half-sister and myself for a while. She had to get permission from the Belgian authorities for us to travel to France. So my father was hiding in Paris with a cousin of his in the 11th arrondissement. And my mother finally was able to travel with my sister and myself to Paris, where we lived with some of her sisters who were married to French Jews and who had French nationality through their marriages. And so for the first 2 years, and I'm talking until July 1942, things were getting worse. the situation in Paris, but it was still beyond comprehension that women and children would be deported. So eventually my father was nearly rounded up in Paris in 1941, and he imagined to escape down into the southern sector, which technically was unoccupied, but it was managed by the Vichy authorities and the Vichy police, who were very anti-Semitic. Anyway, so he was there. We remained in Paris until July 1942. And my mother turned up for the weekly sign-in at the local police station. And it's very important to note, it was not the Nazis, it was the Vichy police. And through a miracle, my sister, who was jealous of me, and my mother was carrying me, and my sister said, put her down. And so we started fighting, and one of the policemen screamed at us, and my mother took us out. And then she crept back to the more kindly policeman, who managed to whisper to her that we were to be rounded up. And long story short, we were smuggled out very early in the morning down into the southern sector, where we did manage to meet up with my father, who by that time was actually in a French camp in the southern part. And the roundup that we missed out on has been well known as the Vel de Hive, the winter stadium, where the women and children were kept for 5 days while the Nazis and the French disputed whether they could deport the children. And long story short, there were over 4,000 children taken at that time, separated from their mothers, and put into the Drancy camp. And most of them eventually deported and died. So there is no way I would have survived, because by that time I was barely 3 years old. Anyway, my mother managed to escape over the mountains into Spain. We were caught at the border, but the Spanish let us in. My sister, being older, was put in a convent, and my mother and I remained in prison for a little while. And then the Joint, an American Jewish charity, were able to provide funding, and we were put in the equivalent of social housing. At that time, the Vichy government got cold feet. And because there was a backlash in France when they physically saw the children being deported, and they offered safe passage. And technically, we were Polish Jews, and there was actually prohibition against us coming in to the United Kingdom. And after the Alien Act in 1905, and the British government actually refused to bring us in. And belatedly, the Americans sent a rescue mission. And in June 1943, I was 3.5, I sailed to America. I think I've used up my 15 minutes. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to let you go then, because the story continues to be remarkable. As you say, you're put on a ship, 3.5 years old.
Yeah.
Do you have any memories of your crossing to America?
Now, it's interesting because as a young child, I had what you could call the escaping dream, that I was being chased. So obviously my subconscious knew we had been in danger. But I had a dream about being on a ship, looking out on a calm sea and seeing what I didn't realize, but I was told later, had been a Nazi submarine stopping our ship mid-Atlantic. And the submariners came onto the ship, and I knew the feeling of fear and I was with a group of children. And they saw us and they let us go, knowing full well who we were. And so I managed to get to America. And there, with the best of intentions, my name was changed. I was put with a foster family, and my past was completely wiped out, my language, everything. And for the next 4 years, I lived with this family. And I had been told I was adopted, but, what did that mean? And it was not until 1947. My father had got to Britain as part of the Polish Free Forces. He had escaped to Lisbon, and he was allowed to stay here. And my foster father told me my parents had been in the war. The Holocaust was not a word I knew. I did remember when America won the war, because I went to an American school and pledged allegiance to the American flag every day. And so I had internalized that obviously America was the most wonderful place. And socially and economically, my family in America were very high up the social scale. So I was put on a plane and returned to parents I didn't remember, who were completely shattered, completely broken in every way. Out of between them, they had, I think it was 11 adult siblings, and only my father had one sister who had survived in Russia during the war. But the whole family, all my grandparents, all my aunts and uncles and cousins were killed, and my parents were dealing with that with very little empathy from me. I have to say, I didn't want to be here. I looked upon them as strangers. So it wasn't a happy ever after fairy tale.
Extraordinary. We may have a photograph of you from 1943 as you were about to depart for America on that Portuguese ship.
I'm the little one in front. Yeah. And my sister is the little girl holding the handbag next to me. We were not on good terms. She was very resentful of this sister. And in her mind, everything that had gone wrong with her life happened after her mother had remarried. And she really resented having a little sister. Yeah.
Extraordinary. Joan, thank you so much for telling your story. A reminder that even those who managed to escape from Europe, from Nazi occupied Europe's, it was not necessarily always a simple happily ever after story. Joan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Leo Geyer is a composer and conductor who spent 8 years researching the lost music of Auschwitz, as a Sky Arts documentary airing tonight has it. Auschwitz is perhaps the best-known symbol of the Holocaust, the largest death camp in human history, where about 1.1 million people, the vast majority, but not all of them Jews, were murdered during World War II. Mindu Hornik, who appears in the film tonight, remembers her arrival at Auschwitz, where she was separated from her mother and her little brother. She says, "We were being directed through the main gate. The smell was terrible, and we didn't know what it was. And this gray, greasy ash falling down. We were taken into Block 14, and we were crying, my sister and I. And there was a lady there who was fed up with us crying. She must have been already seasoned. She'd been there a while. She said, 'Don't be stupid. You're not going to see your mother again. Can you see that smoke coming up and all that dirty ash falling all around us? That's where your mother's gone.'" International Holocaust Memorial Day is on January 27th, in fact, because that is the date the camp was liberated 80 years ago next Monday. Leo, I think many of us will know there was music at Theresienstadt, the model concentration camp that the Nazis used for propaganda purposes. But there was also music at Auschwitz, orchestras, conductors, composers. Can you set the scene for us? When, where, and why was there music at Auschwitz?
Yes, it is a surprising fact. The camp complexes had a number of orchestras. There were at least 6, and their principal focus was to provide marching music, which would enable the prisoners to march in time as they went out to fields and factories, and then on the return. And in many cases, this would involve carrying the dead. The role of the orchestras was also more expansive than that, and in many cases, they would play for the openings of new areas of camps. Or perhaps most disturbing of all is that they would be requested to perform at parties organised by the SS, where there'd be copious amounts of alcohol and food, in stark contrast to that of the prisoners providing the music. So it is somewhat unimaginable to think that there was classical music in this context, but that is the truth, and we must learn it and appreciate it.
There are 2 quotes from Auschwitz survivor Yvette Lennon in the film tonight. She says in the lost music of Auschwitz, talking, I think, about the foxtrots and so on that they played. The SS came to us after killing people to have a rest. And she also says the gas chambers were very close to the orchestra.
Yes, this is true. So particularly for the women's orchestra in Birkenau, is that they were in very close proximity to the crematoria. And so it was certainly, they were very aware of the musicians. And indeed, many people who came off the trains would have heard the women's orchestra in rehearsal. And there seems to be something that was, in most cases, accidental rather than by design. But certainly many people heard the orchestras as they arrived, which instilled a sense of calm, and that people felt that the camp was not as bad as they thought it might be because of hearing orchestral music.
Can you tell us, who were these musicians? Did they come bringing their own instruments? Who were the composers, the conductors? Who was making this music in these unbelievable circumstances?
Initially, the makeup of the orchestras comprised of Polish nationals, and actually Jewish musicians were not allowed to join the orchestras to begin with. But it was only after a period of time that, to improve the quality of the music making, that Jewish performers should be allowed to join the orchestra, and indeed other orchestras sprung up across the camp. Principally, the music that the orchestral musicians were playing was German canonical music. So this was include Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, and in the case of the light German music, this would be popular composers of the day. But what is fascinating when we actually start to study the manuscripts that remain in the archives is that there are actually astonishing stories of how the musicians rebelled, and in many cases incredibly brazen acts. So this would include, for example, weaving in Polish melodies into performances, and unbeknownst to the soldiers, this was a powerful gesture of Polish resistance, as people recognized important melodies and gave them the strength and courage when they had none. We also know that when good news reached of the war, that the men's Auschwitz I orchestra would perform rather than German marches, but American marches. And again, this gesture was unknown to that of the soldiers. And furthermore is that we know that the musicians gave secret performances, and this provided a very rare opportunity for the musicians to express the sorrow and the grief and the torments that they felt. And these are some of the compositions that I've sought to bring to life. Unbelievable. So the heart of the film, anyway, there is detective work, as it were, involved in your archival research and your composing. And the most remarkable discovery, perhaps, is the identity of the composer of Futile Regrets, which we will hear at the end of this segment. I would encourage everyone to watch the film on Sky tonight, or take a look at the Religion Media Center website, where there is an article explaining exactly what Leo did and how. You also researched a piece by Simon Lax, which he said started when at Auschwitz he found a piece of paper smelling of herring and God knows what else. Can you tell us what was involved in your recreating that piece? Yes, so this is a somewhat complicated story. So that Lax found this scrunched up paper on the floor, which had written on it a single melody line, which related to Polish polonaises, again, a very defiant portrayal of Polish culture. And Lax wrote in his testimony that he rearranged this music for a chamber ensemble. Critically, he didn't actually say what that was. One might assume that to be a string quartet, probably one of the most common types of small chamber ensemble. But we know by studying testimonies that there was no cellist in the Birkenau Men's Orchestra at that time, and also no viola player. So in the documentary, I proposed that the instruments that he may well have written for was the violin, clarinet, accordion, and double bass, which would have been the decision I would have made if I was in his position at that time. How I actually got to making that arrangement is somewhat complicated, because the manuscript of that arrangement doesn't exist. It was lost and destroyed by almost everything else in Auschwitz as the Nazis tried to cover their crimes. But Lax was able to remember that arrangement, and he wrote it for piano, which is what I had to work with. And so I was able to rescore that music for piano for that quartet of instruments, so that we are able to hear the music, at least as close as we can, or to the best of our ability, what that music would have sounded like in Auschwitz.
Amazing. And I think we have a clip of the Warsaw Polonaise No. 2 by Simon Lax as recreated by Leo Geyer. Now, Leo, not all of the victims at Auschwitz were Jews. About 70,000 Roma and Sinti people were also murdered there. And you composed a gorgeous piece in memory of Yakob Seel. What can you tell us about him?
Yes, so I was very eager to ensure that we had some representation of Romani music in the documentary, which was something of a considerable challenge, because the gypsy camp, as it was known in Auschwitz, was almost entirely annihilated. And so we have very, very little understanding of what happened in that camp, especially in relation to the music. However, we do know the story of Yakob Seel, who, like all incoming prisoners, was forced to part with his clothes and his belongings, and that, of course, included his violin. And he couldn't bear to part with his violin, and so he gave the performance of his life, stark naked. And it's described in testimonies that he made astonishing sobbing tones from his violin, and this spared him from the gas chambers, and he was recruited into the Auschwitz I men's orchestra. But what is even more astonishing is that Yakob Seel could not read music, but he only needed someone to play a melody once, and he would play it back perfectly. And he's described as being one of the best violinists in the orchestra. So he seemed to be the perfect protagonist to write a piece in memory. And as you will have heard, I've spent the last 10 years researching and restoring this music, and therefore my own composition voice is not important. It is that of everyone else. But through this piece, I had the opportunity to put down in music how I feel about this history, which has got heavier over the last 10 years as I've discovered more and more. And so I felt I was able to say something through this solo violin piece.
That actually leads into a question that's just come in from the chat from Margaret Calvert. Leo, how did you care for yourself as you encountered these individual stories, and how did you recruit your musicians? Thank you, Margaret.
Yes. So in relation to caring for myself, it is an important one, because this history is incredibly difficult, needless to say, and certainly for doing it for such a long time has become very difficult. And I have to say that I've been to Auschwitz now over 10 times, and usually for several days at a time. And I have to work in the archives, which is within the Auschwitz complex itself. So I have to walk under the gate Arbeit macht frei every time. And it is incredibly difficult. And in fact, the last time I went, I had a splitting headache for the entire duration, which only cleared once I left. I suppose the only way that I can look after myself is to express how I feel in the music, and to really focus on the music and to acknowledge why it is I'm doing this work, which is to provide the public with this music to further enable opportunities for Holocaust learning and commemoration. The musicians in the documentary are representations of some of the communities who perished in Auschwitz. So we have a strong contingent of Jewish musicians. The performer of my solo violin piece is also of Roma ethnicity. But another thing that we were very eager to do was to ensure that our orchestra was diverse and representative of the UK population at large. Because also, like myself, I am not Jewish, Polish or Romani, but I am human. And I feel that the Holocaust was the greatest tragedy that humanity unleashed upon itself. And my aspiration is that with this music that we all come together to commemorate and to learn, and so that together we can do better.
Leo, thank you. I had one more question, but I feel like I need to let that hang for a moment there. In the film, you say two things about music that particularly struck me. One is that music can be helpful in situations like that, and also that at Auschwitz, music was weaponized.
Yes, well, firstly, in relation to weaponization, is that we can think about how music was used as part of the infrastructure of the camp. The primary purpose of the orchestra was to provide this relentless beat, which prisoners had to march in time with. And that shows that music is transported from being something for pleasure and entertainment to a purely functional purpose. And of course, whilst the musicians, in some people's view, were looked on as being part of this infrastructure, part of the Nazis' machine, the musicians had very little choice. It was to either perform and play or to go to the gas chamber. And for them, the orchestras provided the greatest possibility for revolt, which was to survive. So that is what I meant to say the weaponization of music. To say then, in contrast, that music can be helpful is that we must remember that music is an abstract art form. It does not have the capacity to say specific things or give specific meaning. But music can speak in emotion, in pure emotion. And therefore, with something so enormous as the Holocaust, where words will always fall short, I think music can help us to find time and the opportunity for reflection, for solace, and for thinking.
Leo, it's an extraordinary project. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I mentioned the piece Futile Regrets. You managed to track down the identity of the composer. I'm not going to do any spoilers. I would encourage people to look at the Religion Media Center website or to watch the film tonight. But I believe we can hear a bit of that piece, which you reconstructed, recreated, and set to music for the orchestra. Just a short excerpt of Futile Regrets. Thank you. Thank you, Ollie, and thank you, Leo. Laura Marks has been chair of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust since 2016. She's an activist in the world of interfaith relations, co-founding Nisa Nashim, the Jewish-Muslim Women's Network, and also founding Mitzvah Day, an annual event in November, encouraging people to do good deeds. It is the UK's largest faith-based day of social service, attracting over 55,000 people to dedicate time and effort. Laura Marks, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. And I have to start with Leo's words, actually, which is he said, I'm not Jewish, Polish, or Romani, but I am human. And thank you for saying that, Leo. That has been written on my piece of paper and into my heart and soul, because Holocaust Memorial Day is for everybody because we're all human. And Holocaust Memorial Day is on the 27th of January, as you said, the day of the liberation of the largest, most notorious concentration camp that the Nazis built in Poland. And it's on that day that we remember the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were murdered by the Nazis. We remember the other people who were murdered by the Nazis. Leo, you referred to the Romani people. But also people who are disabled, people who are black, people who are gay, people who are different. And we remember subsequent genocides in Rwanda, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Darfur, because genocide didn't end in 1945. Sadly, people continued killing each other, hating each other for who they are. And so on Holocaust Memorial Day, we ask everybody, regardless of their faith, ethnicity, background, we ask everybody to think about what we can do to make the world a better and safer place.
So, as you say, there have been atrocities since then. There's a powerful quote from Holocaust survivor Ivor Pearl in The Lost Music of Auschwitz. He explains why he's telling his story, which he says, when I go around talking about my experiences, it's painful, but I feel as though humanity has got to learn. And if humanity doesn't learn, it will happen again and again and again. It might come in a different overcoat, but one has to be very careful. Where does Holocaust education and Holocaust Memorial Day fit into this vision of remaining human, educating, and stopping further atrocities of these kinds?
Holocaust education and commemoration is part of our need to remember that we are basically all human and we're all in it together. And the Holocaust was, if you like, the sort of mother of all genocides. Nothing like that. No, never since, never before, and hopefully never again has there been a systematic, industrialized, deliberate, government-led global policy of trying to wipe out a people. But there have been subsequent attempts to deliberately attack people for who they are, and we still see it today. We have modern day hatred going on. We have modern day anti-Semitism. We have modern day Islamophobia. The area of hate crime that's increased has been faith-based hate crime, where other hate crime has much less so. So one day of the year, we really focus on, I mean, obviously all the time we should be thinking about it, but one day of the year we really focus on what we can do to make the world a better and safer place. So let me just sort of a few sort of basic things that I really need to communicate, which is around, next Monday is Holocaust Memorial Day. There will be events all over the country for everybody to get involved. There'll be a national ceremony, which will be televised actually this year on BBC One. That's at 7:00, and we encourage everybody to watch that. We'll also be very aware that the King is going to Auschwitz that day, and that's really important because it's not just that the King's going to Auschwitz, and that's interesting, but the King symbolises Britain, if you like. He is the ultimate arbiter of British identity, I guess, whatever you feel about monarchy. And by him going and taking such an active part in Holocaust commemoration, he is saying to us, this applies to all of us. This is a British, in fact, it's an international issue, the need to accept people for who they are, not to other people, not to systematically or unintentionally make people different because of who they are. So it's something very important that as a national community, we can come together, and Holocaust Memorial Day is about coming together to think about how we challenge identity-based hatred. And we encourage people at 8:00, there's a national moment at 8:00 where we all put a candle in our windows and remember people who were victims of the Nazis, or people who are continuing to be victimized today. And we ask people to come along, wherever you are. Hopefully you'll find something to do with Holocaust Memorial Day. If you go to the cinema, if you go to a Pearl and Dean screen, they're showing a film about the Holocaust. We've done projects for 80 years, for 80 candles. We've done all sorts of things to encourage people, whoever you are, you can do something to make the world better and safer. Learning about the Holocaust is very important. But what really matters to me is what happens, what do you do with that knowledge? Also very important is we listen to Joan, we watch the film. I'm at City Hall at the moment at the Holocaust Memorial Day event going on downstairs here. And we heard another survivor. We heard Eva Clark, who was born in Munchausen, a baby of the Holocaust. And we also heard a Bosnian survivor speaking, because the patterns that lead to genocide, the patterns that lead to people hating each other are always the same. We always go through the stages. So if you have hateful language, it doesn't always lead to genocide, of course, but all genocide starts with hateful language. So we can all be aware and do something to make sure that certainly in our own sphere and wherever we have influence, we check ourselves and we think about prejudice. And could this lead to things getting worse?
So thank you. It's impossible to talk about the Holocaust today without reflecting what is happening in the Middle East today, as the first 3 Israeli hostages to be released in over a year are now with their families, as Palestinian prisoners have been released, as a ceasefire has begun. We know that events in the Middle East don't stay in the Middle East. They spill over into the rest of the world. What can you tell us about anti-Semitism and about Islamophobia in our contemporary world, and how we should be thinking about that and responding to it as we approach Holocaust Memorial Day?
So the first thing I would say is that the events in Israel and Gaza over the last 18 months have rocked us all. Regardless of your political stance, it's impossible to have watched what's happened over the last 18 months without feeling despair, horror, upset. Wherever you come from, there has been a horrendous war going on there, and we can just hope that what happened yesterday with the release of some of the hostages will be the start of some sort of peace. I'm sure that everybody hopes and prays that that's the case. But what is really also interesting is how that's played out here, and how around the world the reverberations of what's going on in the Middle East, as always, plays out in local communities. And people here, particularly Jews and Muslims, tend to be blamed for what's going on there. And the surge in hatred, both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred, have been horrendous and shocked us all. And it's so easy and so thoughtless to blame people for events that are thousands of miles away and way beyond any of our control, and to use that as reasons to have negative feelings, even through to hatred, about people who are here. So this Holocaust Memorial Day taking place in that context, we need to be very mindful that hatred, as I said, didn't end in 1945. We still blame people for things that are completely out of their control, completely irrelevant to the life of British Jews or British Muslims. There are people, of course, who are stoking the hatred around the world and in this country. There are people who are deliberately making mileage, if you like, out of the misery in the Middle East. But it's our job to counterbalance that, to challenge it, and to say, you know what? Holocaust Memorial Day is not about the Middle East conflict. Holocaust Memorial Day is about remembering the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, the Roma people, the Black people, the people who were, all the people who were targeted by the Nazis and the people targeted in subsequent genocides. Our job is to remember them and to say it is not okay for identity-based hatred to take control. And we have it in our power to do something about it. We're not innocent bystanders. We all have agency. We all have the ability to, at a minimum, watch the ceremony. There's a minimum, light a candle, talk to your neighbors, do something as a result of Holocaust Memorial Day. We say, we have a saying, we say, we want people to learn more. We want people to feel more, and we want people to do more. And what Joan and what Leo have done is they've enabled us to feel more. You listen to the work they're doing. They're talking about their experiences and putting together this astonishing music, and you feel it in your gut. But we need people to do more than that. We need people to hear it and feel it and do something. So, and that's where we all have agency. And that's what Holocaust Memorial Day is about. It's about the future. And our theme this year is for a better future. We are 80 years on. Joan is one of the youngest Holocaust survivors. She's out there, sparky and bright and telling her story. But there's not many, really, who are still able to do that. And now it's our turn, whether we're Jewish or Muslim or anything. As we started at the beginning, this is a universal issue. As Leo said, we are all human. And our job is to go out and make the world a safer place.
Thank you for that. Laura, a question has been put to me in the chat, and it's specifically around the word genocide, which is being more than bandied about now. It's actually in front of international organizations as to whether that's an appropriate term to be applying to what's happening in the Middle East now. I don't know if that's a question you want to get into.
Well, it's a question that everybody's asking. So,
yeah.
I would be naive if I didn't. Obviously, I know that this is a big issue. I would say a couple of things. First of all, as I said, what's going on in the Middle East, from whatever angle you look at it, is awful. The term genocide has been very politicized. It's been very weaponized. At the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, our job is not to define genocide. That's a job for international courts, for governments, and actually, we go with the British government's definition of genocide. And the British government has very clear perspective on what's genocide, and we follow their model. And we don't get hung up on this. It's very easy to get hung up on this. What we say is, we remember the people who were murdered in the Holocaust. Let's go back to why we're here. We're here to remember millions of people who have been systematically murdered. The Holocaust was 6 million Jews and countless million others. Cambodia was several million. Rwanda was nearly 1 million people. These are industrialized examples of people being murdered for who they are. We can get hung up on the terms, but actually, let's remember why we're here. We're here to remember people who have been systematically murdered because of who they are, and really focus on that on the 27th of January.
Laura, thank you. I have sneakily, as chair, left a couple of minutes at the end to see if Leo, Laura, and Joan have any questions they want to ask each other.
Leo, I'm really looking forward to seeing the film. I think it's going to be wonderful. What are you hoping to achieve from it?
Well, what I'm hoping is 80 years on, as you say, from the liberation of Auschwitz, is to provide the public with a new means to engage with this history. And particularly, I'm very conscious, as you've said also, that, and it's fantastic, Joan, that you're here with us. But of course, as you say, Laura, that there are few survivors now who are able to tell their story. And I have the words of Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, the now sole survivor of the Auschwitz orchestras. I have her words ringing through my head, which is inherits the truth. And we are at this stage in this history where we, as the next generation, needs to take this history onward. And therefore, I can't give a testimony of what it was like in Auschwitz because I wasn't there. So I need to find a way that I can continue the message and the mission onwards. And so my ambition is that this documentary is part of that. I admit to say that I'm somewhat fatigued of doing this project for 10 years. It's exhausting to study deeply such a horrific time in human history, but I haven't finished yet. And my company and I will be doing an opera ballet production about this music and the stories of the musicians of Auschwitz, which we'll be doing in the Bloomsbury Theatre in June of this year. So my work continues, and I suspect it will do for some time.
Joan Salter, Leo Geyer, and Laura Marks, thank you all very much for being with us. There's no way for me to say in words how important your stories, your testimony, your research, your activism is, how inspiring it is, and my thanks. And I will hand back to Ruth in case there are any final thoughts. I'll just thank everybody who has joined us in the briefing today, and enormous thanks to Joan, to Leo, and to Laura.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you all for taking part, and I will contact the speakers with the YouTube link so that you can access it soon. And thank you to everyone else who joined on the call.